I do want to talk about the need for innovation, and I want to explain why. And for those, by the way, who want to get a deeper view, this builds on my chapter in a book called A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And that, by the way, for those who are interested in the sustainability challenge broadly, including climate change, but also issues around water and air pollution and waste, is full of interesting essays on how we might do things in new and different and better ways in response to these environmental challenges as we move forward. So again, our context today, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, is that the global community is gathering in November in Glasgow, in Scotland, to take forward the worldwide effort to respond to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this meeting, which is called the Conference of the Parties, is undertaken each year by the now 195 countries that have signed on to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the meeting is called, for short, COP, Conference of the Parties, that's the acronym, 26, because this is the 26th time that all of those countries have gathered to think together and negotiate together how the world is going to respond to climate change. And that conversation is really the backdrop of what I want to talk about today. I also want to mention, and I'm sure, again, many of you have seen or heard about this, the recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And that group, that is the worldwide network of scientists thinking about and working on questions of climate change, produced recently their assessment report 6, called AR6 for those who want to follow the acronyms. And this 6th assessment report signals that the problem of climate change is increasingly serious, perhaps going to deliver bigger impacts, at least in some cases, than we thought, and maybe approaching faster than had been imagined. And the science community is telling us we need a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gases at an earlier point in time. Really, by 2050, we need to be at net zero emissions. If we are not there, we risk more damage from the kinds of things the science community has been signaling for years. And that would be increased intensity and frequency of windstorms, typhoons, hurricanes, changes in rainfall patterns that might bring droughts in some places and terrible fires, which we've seen all around the world this summer. It might also deliver changes in agricultural productivity, and then in some places, floods. So these are the kinds of issues we're worried about. Now, the big focus, I think, in Glasgow of the world community is going to be on whether the consensus can be formalized around the need to reduce emissions dramatically in the next several decades and achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2050. And that is, I think, the central question. It comes officially in the context of what's described as a stocktake. That's a term that comes from the 2015 Paris Agreement, where there was a commitment, as I'm sure, again, all of you know, for each country to make a nationally determined contribution to action on climate change. And again, there's an acronym here that everyone should follow, and that's NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. And so countries all around the world, including China, have made substantial commitments to action in their own country to reduce emissions. And this stocktake, which is a year delayed because of the pandemic, so occurring now at the 6-year point instead of 5, is going to review country by country who has delivered on their nationally determined contribution, and frankly, who has not. It's also going to seek to aggregate across all of those NDCs and determine whether the global community is on track. And I don't want to be a spoiler, but I have to tell you that we know the answer already. We don't have to wait for the global community to gather in Glasgow. We know, because of the 6th assessment report from the IPCC, that the world is not on track to achieve the level of emissions reduction required to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So the language you're going to see a focus on in Glasgow is the need for greater ambition. We are already hearing people say that. The UN Secretary General just a couple of weeks ago, in commenting on the IPCC report, said we must understand that the problem of climate change is now very severe. He called it code red for humanity, and said that every nation needs to come to Scotland prepared for bigger commitments in order to ensure that the world as a whole can bring down emissions at the pace required and as signaled by the science community. Now, there are a number of nations that have already put forward new commitments, increased in terms of their targets, their own promise to the world. The European Union, for example, has said not only will they be at net zero emissions by 2050, they have announced a 2030 goal, so not very far away, of emissions coming down 55% from where they were at 1990, their baseline year. The Biden administration in the United States has also pledged a net zero target by 2050, with a net zero electricity sector, the largest source of emissions, by 2035. So again, not very far away, a decade and a bit away, to have a net zero electricity generation sector. As Carol told you a few minutes ago, China is currently with a commitment of net zero emissions by 2060. But there is a lot of interest in having China step up to a greater commitment and join the world community in making a net zero greenhouse gas commitment by 2050. Of course, China is doing many things that would help it get there. A world leader in solar power, in creation of wind turbines, in building out some of the batteries and storage for electricity that are required for a zero emissions transportation sector in the future, and to support the putting of renewable power onto the electric grid. But the real question for all of us, China as well as the rest of the world, is are we ready to really make a move to net zero emissions? There's no doubt that we need to get there from a science point of view. There's growing political momentum, but the question is, how do we get there? And that's where innovation comes into the play. In the United States, in Europe, in China, there are a growing number of academics, government officials, policy experts looking at the question of how to achieve deep decarbonization. That's the idea of moving to that target of zero net emissions out over the next several decades. In the United States, I have worked on one of these studies, which I think we might have sent along to some of you to look at, called the Zero Carbon Action Plan, or ZCAP. And in that ZCAP, the team that I worked with, almost 100 researchers across the United States of America, focused on 6 critical sectors where transformative change will be required. The first is electricity. We're going to need to produce our electric power in new and different and better ways. Wind power, solar power, in effect, renewable energy that is clean and available out over time. The second category is transportation. We need to have zero emissions cars, trucks, and ultimately trains and planes. The third category is industry, manufacturing. The things we make, we are going to need to make in better ways that don't create emissions, no greenhouse gas emissions. A fourth category is buildings. We're going to need to ensure that all of our buildings are net zero emissions, carbon neutral going forward. The fifth sector we looked at is land use and sustainable agriculture. A lot of emissions coming from how we currently produce our food. We're going to have to change that. And in addition to reducing emissions, we are going to need to increase the work of what are known as carbon sinks. These are ways we absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. And again, I'm sure most of you know that the most important thing in that category is the work of photosynthesis of green plants, particularly trees. So we are going to need to do a lot of tree planting. And again, this is something where China has really played a major role. China has done a dramatic job in the last 20 years of tree planting, but all of us are going to need to do much more. The sixth sector that we looked at is materials, where there's going to, again, need to be transformation. We are especially going to need to do things in different ways for packaging. Plastics as a material are quite challenging. So all of this requires a quite significant shift from where we are today to a clean energy future. Now, the key to progress across almost all of those sectors will be electrification, moving from burning of fossil fuels to clean powered electricity, doing much of our energy work. And that will, of course, require significant renewable energy. It'll require better batteries and storage to make that renewable energy work. It'll also be helped by significant investments in energy efficiency. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the challenge is we have some parts of that strategy that are moving quite well. We're building out, again, in China, in Europe, in the United States, really all over the world, lots of wind power, a growing amount of solar energy. But what we don't know is how to decarbonize some sectors, particularly steel making, cement making, aviation. We do not have, and this is what all of the studies that I have seen, my own zero carbon action plan, but the 4 or 5 others that are being done, helping to map out pathways in the United States to deep decarbonization. The similar studies I've seen for Europe and for other parts of the world still don't have clarity on what's required for these tough to decarbonize sectors. So in that regard, we need innovation. We're going to need a set of incentives, what I call green lights, signals to the creative spirits in our societies, to the entrepreneurs, to the business community, to help step up and solve our climate change problem. Now, what is the key to these tough to decarbonize sectors? It might be hydrogen. It might be new ways to capture carbon, which would allow us to continue to burn some fossil fuels if we could capture the air pollution and the carbon dioxide emissions. Now, again, in the carbon capture discussion, there are 2 big categories. One is what's known as nature-based solutions, and that is more trees, more plants, more photosynthesis. And there's a lot of interest in how to make that happen more effectively. The other is the idea of engineered carbon capture, and that would require some, again, innovation to be done cost effectively. And the conversation is turning on what's known as direct air capture, pulling the carbon dioxide out of our air. All of that, again, is going to require a structure of government policies in every country that create incentives for investment in terms of time and money, new technologies. So the sort of bottom line of what I want to offer you to think about today is, what are those green lights that provide the signal to all of us to change our behavior, to be more climate change aware, to reduce our emissions in our schools, our homes, our communities, and then particularly what are the signals to the business community that will drive investment in innovation. Let me close by saying that my view of innovation is quite broad. We of course need technology development to bring down the cost of renewable energy, bring down the cost of wind turbines, of solar power, but we also need innovation in the supporting technologies around that. So a smart grid, smart appliances in our homes, smart homes that will use much less energy, but still give us the same benefits, have the same capacity to keep our food cool in a refrigerator, to provide cooking, heating, light. All of that needs to be done in a much more efficient and ultimately climate neutral way. Third, we need, again, innovation in government policies, and in the signals government send through regulation. We also need governments to provide better data, better information, better metrics that allow us to track progress. And that is one of the important other agenda items for the climate change negotiations in Glasgow in November. As I mentioned, there will be a stock take, but there will also be a focus on measurement of emissions, review, and verification to make sure that we've got the right numbers in place, because having the facts clear is essential if we're to have a successful strategy implemented out over the coming decades of reducing emissions. Finally, we need innovation in finance. We're going to need to find ways to put a much more money into building out clean energy infrastructure in every country in the world. You heard mention that I, while the commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, launched a green bank to try to ramp up the flow of private capital, not government money, but using limited government resources, leveraging banks and other sources of private capital to do much more in the way of building out, in my case, the state of Connecticut's solar power, wind power, and commitments to this clean electricity future. We're going to need such green banks and green bonds and other sources of investment in the clean energy future all over the world. To do this will require innovation in partnerships, innovation in who's involved, and it will require, from my perspective, public engagement. How do we bring people all over the world, including 1.3 billion Chinese citizens, into the conversation around climate change? Because all of us have an important role to play, and probably success in the global response to climate change depends more on what gets done in China than on any other country in the world. So I'm pleased that you all are being challenged to step up to the problem of climate change, and I'm eager to talk about what that might entail in response to your questions. So with that, let me stop and say thank you all. And Wan Tian, I am ready for questions, and we'll try to provide some answers.